Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we're wading into some murky, freezing cold waters. And I have to warn you, the topic we're covering today, it usually makes people take a step back.
It definitely does.
We are talking about black metal.
And that's a topic that comes with a lot of baggage.
Right. Because when I say black metal, I know exactly what pops into your head. You're picturing guys in corpse paint, maybe some unintelligible screaming.
Burning churches.
Controversy on the evening news. Basically chaos. It's often dismissed as just noise or shock value. But the research we have in front of us today, this stack of articles and analyses, it paints a completely different picture.
It really reframes the whole conversation. I mean, when you actually dig into the source material, you realize that whole caricature of the genre, it just misses the point entirely.
The sources describe black metal as arguably the most conceptual, aesthetic, and, culturally complex genre in the history of heavy metal.
Which is a huge claim.
It's a huge claim. So our mission today is to test that. We're going to trace what the source material calls the genealogy of darkness.
And genealogy is the perfect word for it.
Yeah.
Because when you look at these columns on aesthetics and history, you realize black metal isn't just a musical style. It's a total cultural phenomenon.
Okay.
It's this massive intersection of religious views, geography, ethics, philosophy.
That's the insight that hooked me, the idea that you can't separate the sound from the place it came from. So we're going to move beyond the blast beats to understand why this music sounds the way it does.
And to do that, we have to start with the atmosphere. The source makes a bold claim. Black metal is the most aesthetic of all metal genres. It's not just about playing fast or heavy.
No.
It's about creating a specific feeling, a feeling of darkness, cold, and isolation.
Okay, but let's play devil's advocate for a second. Every metal genre claims to be dark, right? I mean, how is this different from, say, Black Sabbath back in 1970?
Yeah. That's a great question, and it's kind of the root of the family tree. The source notes that Black Sabbath, they established the fundamental ominous mood. They brought the occult and that sense of foreboding doom right to the forefront.
Sure.
But musically, Sabbath was bluesy, it was heavy, yeah, but it had a groove. It swung. Black metal required a new wave of extremism to really form its identity. It needed to lose the groove.
Which brings us to the first wave. We're in the early 80s now, and we have to talk about the band that literally gave the genre its name, Venom.
You absolutely cannot skip Venom. They were a British band formed in 1979, and in 1982 they released an album.
Titled Black Metal.
And that album title became the banner for the whole movement.
But here's the catch, and the source is really specific on this. Venom didn't actually sound like the black metal we know today.
No, not at all. And I think that's a common misconception. If you listen to Venom now, it sounds like Motorhead meets Satan.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It was thrash, it was punk, it was speed metal, it was rowdy, beer-drinking music. The source highlights that Venom was significant for the attitude in the theater.
So it's more about the image.
Exactly. They used Satanism to shock the establishment, to freak out parents. It was performative. It was fun. They weren't like sitting in a cave contemplating the void. They were putting on a show.
So Venom provided the name and the whole leather and specs attitude. But if we're looking for the sound, that distinct buzzing atmospheric wall of noise, we have to look north.
Way north.
We have to look at Sweden and a band called Bathory.
Bathory is the true musical architect here.
Mm-hmm.
And it was essentially one guy, Quorthon. In the mid-'80s, especially with albums like The Return and Under the Sign of the Black Mark, he just stumbled onto something entirely new.
So what was the innovation? Because to the untrained ear, it might just sound like, louder noise.
He stripped the music of its rock and roll, all of it. He introduced these walls of guitar noise, shrieking vocals that sounded like they were echoing from a cave, minimal riffs, and just insane speed. It wasn't about grooving. It was about overwhelming you.
The source mentions something really poetic here. It says, Bathory introduced the Scandinavian cold and dampness into the melody.
Yes.
This is the first time the music started to sound like the place it came from.
Precisely. It separated the sound from the American or the British metal scenes. It wasn't just about being heavy anymore. It was about being cold. And this aesthetic of cold becomes the defining characteristic as we move into the most critical era.
The second wave. This is where the story shifts to Norway in the early 90s, and according to our notes, this is where black metal stops being just a music genre.
And becomes a global cultural phenomenon.
Yeah.
The period from, say, 1990 to 98 in Norway is the eye of the storm. This scene was driven by a group of very young, very radical musicians. We're talking teenagers or 20-somethings.
And they made some really specific artistic choices that define the genre forever.
They did.
Let's break those down because they seem so counterintuitive. The first thing that stands out is the production quality. They embraced lo-fi recording.
Right, and you have to understand the context. At this time, death metal bands like Morbid Angel or Cannibal Corpse was getting really popular and polished. The production was getting cleaner, more technical.
Right.
The Norwegian black metal bands hated that. They saw it as commercial, as fake, so they went the opposite direction on purpose.
So it wasn't just that they couldn't afford good microphones?
I mean, in some cases, sure, budget was an issue. But it became an aesthetic. They wanted it to sound raw. They used cheap equipment to create a neck-grow sound, as they called it. It was about creating distance.
And this is where we get the term tremolo-picking. For anyone listening who's not a musician, what is that exactly?
Sure. So instead of playing a riff with a groove or a chug, you're picking the guitar string extremely fast up and down, constantly. When you do that with high distortion and really low fidelity recording, the individual notes just blur together.
It creates a wall of sound.
A buzzing wall of sound. It sounds less like a guitar and more like a swarm of bees, or static, or just wind.
It's a texture, not a melody.
Exactly. And then you bury the vocals in that mix so they sound like a distant scream.
Yeah.
It creates this huge atmosphere. It's meant to be hypnotic.
They also adopted the visuals to match. The corpse painting their faces black and white to look like the dead. And the lyrics shifted away from just Satan to winter, forests, isolation.
Yeah, but we can't talk about the second wave without addressing the inner circle.
Right.
The source material discusses this impartially, but it's a huge part of why the world started paying attention. This was the group centered around a record shop in Oslo called Helvete.
Run by Euronymous.
Yes, the guitarist for the band Mayhem. And the story of Mayhem it's basically the story of the second wave's escalation into reality. It started with their vocalist, Dead.
His stage name was literally Dead.
It was. He was a deeply troubled young man obsessed with death. And in 1991, he committed suicide. Now, in any other genre, this would be a tragedy that stopped the music.
Or at least caused a pause, right?
Right. In black metal, it was mythologized.
The source notes that this event brought death and non-humanity out of the lyrics and into the genre's reality. It wasn't theater anymore like it was with Venom.
No, it became real. And from there, things just escalated. We have the wave of church burnings across Norway in '92.
Where historic wooden stave churches were destroyed.
Yes, and then the murder of Euronymous himself in 1993.
These are incredibly dark events, and the source is careful to just report the facts here. We're not glorifying this. But the analysis suggests that these crimes transformed the genre.
They absolutely did. It became a phenomenon fueled by reality. It caught the world's attention because the line between the art and the artist's actions had completely vanished. People weren't just listening to the music. They were fascinated by the extremity of it all. It gave the music this dangerous aura that no other genre had.
However, and this is a big however, if we look past the headlines, the music that came out of this era was surprisingly diverse. It wasn't just one sound.
That is the most surprising part for people new to the genre. You might expect it all to sound the same, considering how strict the ideology was, but the artistic output was incredibly varied.
Okay, so give us some examples.
All right. You had a band like Dark Throne, who defined that unholy lo-fi sound. They stripped everything back. Drums that sounded like cardboard boxes, guitars that sounded like chainsaws. It was primitive on purpose.
Then you look at Burzum, the project of Varg Vikernes.
Burzum went in a completely different direction. Minimalism. The source describes it as using repetition to create a trance-like state. The goal was this sense of time collapsing. He would play the same riff for 7, 8, 10 minutes. It was hypnotic, almost ambient.
And then on the completely other end of that spectrum, you have Emperor.
Emperor. They introduced keyboards, complex arrangements. They wanted to create a symphonic soundscape. It was majestic, orchestral, almost classical in its ambition. It showed that black metal could be musically sophisticated, not just raw noise.
And we can't forget Immortal. While everyone else was focused on reality or Satanism, Immortal they made up their own world.
They did. They just rejected the whole true crime reality completely. They built this whole fantasy mythology about a fictional icy world called Blashirk. It was pure escapism, focusing on this idea of an eternal winter battleground.
So within just a few years in Norway, you had lo-fi punk, hypnotic trance, symphonic orchestras, and high fantasy.
All under the same banner.
That diversity is probably why the genre didn't just die out when the inner circle dissolved. Instead, it went global. Which leads us to the third and fourth waves from '98 all the way up to today.
The scene just exploded outwards. And as it moved, it mutated. It adapted to the local cultures it landed in. When it hit the United States USBM, US black metal, it took on a whole new flavor.
The source mentions bands like Wolves in the Throne Room. They're from the Pacific Northwest, right?
Yes, this is often called a Cascadian style. And I mean, think about the geography of Washington state. It's rain, deep forests, mountains. They took that Norwegian obsession with nature and just applied it to their own wilderness.
But the philosophy changed, didn't it?
It did. The Norwegians often saw nature as hostile, a cold place where you die. The Cascadian bands, they were influenced by the environmental movement in the U.S. They viewed nature as something to worship, something to protect.
So it became about ecology.
It became about ecology and a spiritual connection to the earth. But then you also have the darker, more psychological side in the U.S. with bands like Leviathan and Thastar.
Right, the subgenre often called depressive or suicidal black metal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It shifted the focus from external blasphemy-like burning churches to internal darkness. It became about personal anguish, mental illness, isolation. It's incredibly heavy, emotional music.
Meanwhile, over in France, things were getting intellectual.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. France developed this fascinating scene, spearheaded by bands like Decibel Omega. They're known for these incredibly complex avant-garde song structures and deep philosophical lyrics. They treated black metal as high art, dealing with metaphysics and theology. It's very dense, very challenging music.
It really seems like every region added its own ingredient. But then we see a kind of softening of the genre, or maybe blurring is a better word. We need to talk about post-black metal and black gaze.
This is a controversial shift for the purists, but it was a massive one for the genre's growth. Bands like Alcest and later Deaf Heaven took that black wall of sound, the tremolo picking, the blast beats, and mixed it with shoegaze.
Shoegaze being that dreamy, reverb-heavy indie rock from the UK.
Exactly. So suddenly you had this beauty in the noise. It was melodic, emotional even, uplifting at times, but still used the instrumentation of black metal. It opened the door for people who would never listen to Darkthrone.
And geographically, it just kept spreading. The source lists Eastern Europe, with bands like Drud focusing on paganism and folklore.
And even East Asia, with bands like Zuriaki incorporating local culture.
Zuriaki is a great example.
It is. They use traditional Chinese instruments and wear traditional straw rain capes on stage. It shows that black metal became a vessel. You could pour any culture's folklore or history or landscape right into it.
This brings us to the core analysis. Why did this specific sound emerge in the way that it did? The source has this section on the aesthetics of cold and isolation.
This connects all the way back to what we said at the start, the environment. The analysis in our source argues that the sound of black metal is a direct reflection of the freezing wilderness and the long winters of the North. It is, quote, atmospheric music born of geography.
It makes perfect sense. If you live in a place where it's dark for half the year and the landscape is frozen, your art is going to reflect that.
Exactly. It's environmental determinism in music.
It's interesting how even within Scandinavia, the different countries had different takes on this cold.
They really did.
Yeah.
Norway was that cold, anti-Christian, tremolo-heavy, sound jagged and harsh. But Sweden was more melodic. Bands like Dissection had higher production quality. They cared about musicality, about harmony. They wanted the cold to be beautiful.
And Finland?
Finland was raw, primitive, and ritualistic. Bands like Beharit were less about melody and more about the filth and the ritual. It was uglier in a very deliberate way.
So what does this all mean? We've gone from Venom playing sloppy speed metal in Newcastle to teenagers in Norway to a global scene that includes nature worship in Washington, avant-garde philosophy in France, and folk metal in China.
If we look at the big picture, it's a paradox. And this is the key takeaway for me. Black metal is a genre built on isolation. It was built on misanthropy, hating humanity, and rejecting the mainstream. It wanted to be inaccessible. Right. It wanted to be unlistenable to the average person.
It built a wall of noise to keep people out.
Precisely. And yet, that wall became a bridge. It evolved into this diverse global artistic language.
Yeah.
It turns out that darkness and nature are universal concepts. Whether you're in Ukraine or Japan or the US, people found that this specific harsh sound was the perfect way to express their own versions of that.
It's almost like the restrictiveness of the genre, the rules about how it had to sound, actually forced people to be more creative within those boundaries.
That's a great point, and it forced them to look inward at their own cultures. When you listen to Drudk, you're hearing Ukrainian poetry. When you listen to Wolves in the Throne Room, you're hearing the American rainforests. It became a way to explore heritage through a dark lens.
It's a wild journey, from shock rock to essentially high art.
It really is. And I think the source sums it up beautifully when it says that black metal is now a comprehensive cultural phenomenon. This holds coldness, darkness, spirituality, rebellion, and solitude all in the same time.
Well, I certainly have a new appreciation for the wall of sound. It's not just noise, it's the sound of a freezing landscape.
It is. And for you, listening, I'd leave you with this thought. In a world that is increasingly connected, bright, and digital, maybe the enduring appeal of black metal is that it offers a space for the opposite, a space for isolation, for the primitive, for the shadows. It acknowledges that darkness is a part of the human experience, and it gives that darkness a shape.
That is a powerful thought to end on. There is beauty in the noise if you're willing to listen for it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the darkness. We'll see you next time.